Welcome, I'm Professor David Holden. I'm a military historian and a veteran. All these views are my own and in no way represent the U.S. Army or the U.S. government. So, we're all familiar with the tragedy of suicide. Have you ever thought about what it looks like to commit national suicide? There's many ways you can do it. Historically speaking, there's war, there's economic collapse, there's moral decline, there's social disintegration. But you can also do it philosophically, because philosophy undergirds so much of how we live and find meaning in this world. And thus, the philosophy pervading America today that's leading us towards national suicide is postmodernism.
Because it turns out explaining postmodernism is hard, and I'll probably need a lot of audience feedback to even figure out what parts I'm failing to say. So consider my Curse of Knowledge video as sort of episode 0 for this series because it applies to postmodernism hard. In my experience, postmodernism sounds like absolute gibberish to people.
So today, we're going to talk about that. Stick with me. If you want to understand what's happening in the world today, if you want to understand what's happening today in America, you need to understand postmodernism and what it is.
So postmodernism is a really amorphous concept and a hard to nail down genre.
It's a squishy term. It's a bit difficult to understand, but I'm going to lay it out in a simple manner, giving you examples and telling you what is behind this philosophy. Postmodernism is everywhere today. It's in our news, it's in our schools and educational system, it's throughout our politics, it's in our entertainment, it's in our music. It pervades everything in America today. So what is postmodernism? Now, to understand postmodernism, you have to understand that it's a reaction to something else, modernity or modernism. I'm going to take you on a trip here through history very quickly to lay out the foundation so that you can understand postmodernism today and how it affects you. Okay, so throughout much of human history, there was this concept called the Great Chain of Being. So at the top you had God, below that you had the king, and maybe next to the king you had the priest, below the priest you had the baron, below the baron you had the knights, and below the knights you had the serfs, right? Society was very much vertically organized. Now, throughout time as we've progressed, society's become much flatter. So people lived under kings and queens and khans and pharaohs and priests. You had this elite that pretty much ran society and everybody else worked or fought. That was how life was organized. Then slowly, in fact, the very idea of progress doesn't really enter into how we understand it today, into the modern conception of life, until probably around the 1400s. Slowly over time, though, knowledge begins to accumulate and spread. What really accelerates this is the printing press, right? Invented in China and then makes its way over. And then you have the Gutenberg printing press. You guys probably remember that from high school. In the 1450s, in all of Europe, there was about 30,000 books. Think about that, 30,000 books in all of Europe. Roughly 100 years later, by the mid-1550s, after the printing press begins printing at a rapid rate, you have over 12 million books. With the spread of books, you have the spread of literacy as well, certainly not as fast, and certainly only among your upper classes, but you have the spread of literacy nonetheless. So with the accumulation of knowledge that begins to accelerate now that you're not relying on the oral tradition of spoken word and that being passed down from generation to generation. Now you can accumulate knowledge through books. So through this and the accumulation of knowledge, other ways of living come into being. And people start to question how things are organized and that there might be more rational ways to do this. And this gives way to what we call the Enlightenment. Okay, so the Enlightenment, what is the Enlightenment? So that begins probably in northern Italy, Europe, in the late 1600s and kind of goes through the 1800s. Now the Enlightenment highlights the role of reason and rationality, the value and the growth of science and understanding the natural world. And it downplays the role of religion. Throughout much of man's history, you interpreted the world through some kind of religious lens. Now we're looking at the world through a rational scientific lens. Before we continue, I want to take a second to thank my supporters. It takes a long time to craft videos like this, and if you'd like to support me as I transition to doing this full time, please do so at my website or at the link below at Patreon. Thank you. Francis Bacon develops the scientific method that we can observe the natural world and then deduce knowledge from those observations. You have John Locke, who highlights the importance of private property, the value and the centrality of the individual, the separation of powers because man's intrinsically selfish, if not corrupt, and thus you have to separate powers because as we've seen under these kings and monarchs that we've had throughout history, they can abuse their power. Thus, power should be separated and distributed. So with John Locke, man becomes the center, the logos of reason and authority, not the king and not the government. And out of the Enlightenment, so many wonderful ideas come forth, such as reason, logic, the scientific method, individuality, freedom, equality, tolerance, separation of church and state, popular participation in the rule of government, objective truth that you discern through the sciences. These are all products of the Enlightenment and lay the foundation for Western civilization as we know it today. These ideas were fundamental to informing the American Revolution and later the French Revolution, and laid the groundwork for what came next, which is the Industrial Revolution. The Enlightenment giving way to the Industrial Revolution, modernism, or modernity comes into being. Now, modernity is the idea that you can now use science and reason and all these Enlightenment values to rationally derive a way of living life in the world today, to finding meaning, separate from the church and religious factors, right? Now, you're fundamentally looking through the scientific rational lens for understanding the natural world and your place in it. People began to identify, rather than religiously, through nationalism with their country. You had the growth of capitalism, and then you also, in reaction to the growth of capitalism, you have communism, and then you also have new concepts such as fascism begin to take root in places like Italy and Germany as well. Then you reach World War I, and that seems to implode everyone's belief that man is progressing towards something better. 20 years later, you have World War II, which is even more traumatic and leaves Europe in ruins, much of Southeast Asia as well. And then you have the nuclear bomb. And so people look around the world and they say, well, this is what modernism brought us? 2 world wars, nuclear weapons. And that gives way, of course, to the Cold War, where everybody's living in a state of fear that at any moment someone could press a button and the world ends. To people looking out at the world, they're saying, so modernity, scientific management, and technology and what we claim is progress led to all of this. So as a result of this, it appears that rationality and science, the general progress of man, and the role and rule of governance had utterly failed us. Enter postmodernism. Postmodernism rejects the Enlightenment principles and everything the Enlightenment stands for. It rejects truth. It rejects objectivity. It rejects the individual. It rejects reason. It calls into question everything. Even the very idea that you can come to some objective understanding of reality is rejected.
I may look femme, but I'm still a them. I may look femme, but I'm still a them. I go by they, he, she. Stop bothering me, please. I may look femme, but I'm still a them.
It fundamentally rejects the organizing principles of nationalism, how we organize our life as nations, perhaps religiously. It even calls into question objectivity, truth, your value system, right? What values we should live by. All that gets called into question. Fundamentally, postmodernism says there's an infinite amount of ways in which you can interpret reality, which is true. But it says, as a result, who's to say your interpretation is valid or more valid than someone else's interpretation of reality? Postmodernism calls into question, deconstructs, and breaks apart everything. That's fundamentally what the philosophy does. It breaks apart everything and questions it. A grand narrative would say America is a nation and a force for good. It would call into question that narrative, the creation narrative, right? That would be a meta narrative. Any complex work like the Bible, they would say, hey, there's thousands of ways that you can interpret it. Who's to say that your interpretation is correct? Right. So it calls into question all these grand narratives and any canonical interpretations. And fundamentally, you could argue, yeah, that's true. You can interpret anything in an infinite amount of ways. They can then use this to attack anything, any book, any religion, any value system, any type of government. But there is a flaw in their reasoning, because they argue that no interpretation should be privileged over another interpretation, right? Because who's to say your interpretation is valid over anyone else's? Now, certainly you can say there's facts and there's rationality and there's science that you can use to prove your position, but again, remember, they don't recognize that because they could say, well, that's a Western construct. And since everything's socially constructed, you constructed that value system to benefit you and marginalize other people that aren't like you. Yet, not all interpretations of life are equally valid, are they? Intuitively, we know that, right? We know there are better ways of living. Furthermore, your interpretation of reality should increase your happiness, your enjoyment of life, your chances at success, and your chances of living, right? Because you can go through life making stupid decisions and living recklessly and die. That would be a poor interpretation of reality. Your choices should fundamentally minimize your suffering and the suffering of others. Your decisions to make the world a better place certainly is a more valid interpretation of living in this world. Postmodernists might say, well, a canonical interpretation of life might be that a couple should get married and then have kids, right? That it's through marriage that you should produce children. That would be a canonical interpretation of the family. And they would say, well, it doesn't have to be like that. There's certainly other ways, right? There's other interpretations, other ways of living your life and having children. Certainly there are. You don't have to get married. But is that going to produce a more well-rounded child? I mean, you could cohabitate, but then you don't have the same kind of commitment. You can do it like the Spartans and the French Revolution and the fascists too, where you have the kid and then, the state, raises it. Those are all other ways of raising children. But certainly some are better than others and produce a child that's more well-rounded and likely to succeed in this life. You can also make the argument of governments. Are all forms of government equally valid? Right? A postmodernist would say, well, who's to say that living in democracy is the best way of living, right? Maybe there's other forms of government. Right? There's dictatorships, there's theocracies, there's monarchies, totalitarian regimes, there's republics. There's a whole host of ways. Who's to say that one's better than another? Or communism, right? There's communist systems. If you've lived under some of these other systems, there seems to be an awful lot of boats and people coming to this country fleeing other types of economic and political systems. So evidently, they seem to think there is a more valid interpretation of reality that we have here in America that, that you don't have in Venezuela or Cuba, for example. And because postmodernism turns your understanding and everyone's understanding of the world upside down, it becomes incredibly difficult to communicate and have conversations with someone that is of this philosophical mind.
This pathway that I'm on is public space, but this park, if you can call that a park, isn't. It is for the use of the residents only, but the only function of this area is to be a marker of social segregation. It makes the residents feel superior. This is one of the many ways in which the space can be violent in this country and reinforce and affirm social segregation.
Instead of you being treated as an individual, now everything's interpreted through groups, right? You belong to a particular group based on your race, your sexual orientation, your gender, and your class. And since reason has gone out the window now, right? Because reason is a Western construct. And by that, I mean it's a product of Western civilization. And the reason they dislike that is because Western civilization is based on those Judeo-Christian values, and it was largely driven and led by white males. And so it's a reaction also against all of that. Because you can't rationally and objectively evaluate reality, instead reality becomes based on feelings, on your lived experience. You've probably heard that in the news recently, right? That's postmodernism. You try to have an argument with somebody and you cite facts and you use rational debate as you logically progress through your argument, and they come back with, well, that's not my truth. My lived reality is whatever it might be, right? Reality is no longer based on science. It's no longer based on reason. Rather, postmodernists say, and you may have heard this, it's socially constructed. Right? Nothing really exists, right? There is no such thing as human nature, right? Everything is a result of social construction. And if it sounds like I'm speaking a different language, it's because I am. This is a totally different language. It's a totally different it's a totally different lens through which to perceive and understand the world. It is not only foreign, but it doesn't align with a scientific, rational, or logical explanation of life. Rather, it's through someone's lived experience, right? Through a marginalized group, right? And so their truth emerges from that.
And I was talking to my partner about gender and how my lack of coherent sense of self and identity interacts with my own gender. And they said that the way that I felt sounded very postmodern.
So you can cite facts and reasons, and they'll just say that does not correspond with my lived experiences, my reality. That is a postmodernist concept. And as a result of postmodernism, you have all these new concepts and ideas entering into mainstream lingo that make no sense unless you have like a degree in gender studies. So here are some of the terms that are recent, like the patriarchy, which refers again to this idea that all white males, European males, have run governments and society, right? That's patriarchy, and they have oppressed everybody that is not of the same racial and ethnic and religious group as them. Cultural appropriation, that's another popular one that you've heard. Toxic masculinity, intersectionality, gender fluid, being gender fluid, right? These are all concepts because gender, right? The idea that there's a male and a female, to them is not a biological fact. As much as, that's why we have these crazy arguments. We're like, no, it's a biological fact. And they're like, no, it's a social construction.
I see a lot of leftists subscribing to the idea of biological determinism of race. Biological determinism is the idea that your race is biologically determined, like by your skin color or your genes. Second, it's completely incongruent with how we conceptualize gender on the left, which we say is socially constructed.
Right? Gender can be whatever you want it to be because they don't recognize those Enlightenment principles that we've talked about. And since everything's socially constructed, that also applies to gender. So if you get an argument, for example, and you say, okay, like Black Lives Matter, for example. Of course, Black Lives Matter, but 70% of all black murders are committed by other blacks. If you watch these riots and these protests that you saw on television, you did get the idea the vast majority of blacks are killed by other whites. But statistically, that's not true at all. But a postmodernist will say, that is not my lived experience. And I live in a system that is systemically racist towards me because I'm a minority. And so you get involved in these conversations, you might cite facts, and they're going to cite their lived experience as being different from those facts because this is their truth. And they don't recognize your truths, right? Because even though you might rationally be arguing it, it doesn't correspond because they can make reality whatever it wants to be because there's an infinite amount of interpretations to reality. So instead of life being about mutual beneficial interactions between me and you, between others, where you compromise, where there's tolerance, and you come to some kind of agreement, right? Those are all products, again, of the Enlightenment, the idea of tolerance, and that through reason and rationality, that we come to some kind of agreement because we've kind of argued through our points and we've reached some kind of compromise. That's gone. In place of that, postmodernism sees all interactions, all hierarchies being about power, right? Everything's about power. So in place of the idea that you're going to compromise with each other, they've replaced everything with power. And then they've done away with the individual, and instead all individuals belong to groups. And you don't have an identity separate from those groups. And thus they have these competing groups based on race, sexual orientation, your gender, and your religion. And it puts these various groups in competition with each other and conflict, which is why you are seeing so much hate and anger today in America. Because you have these various groups, they're all competing for power, and there's no idea of compromise entering into the discussion at all. And it's just me versus you based on wherever you fall into this intersectionality graph, right? So when you send your kid to school, it's no longer about improving and refining their cognitive abilities. Rather, now when you send your kids to school, it's about giving them a social identity and making sure that they fit into one of these various identity groups, which is why we get into what we have today, which is identity politics. This is all a product of postmodernism. I would say America is a force for good, that we intrinsically value the individual, their merit, their skills, their competence, that you have equality of opportunity, not equality of outcome, equality of opportunity, to then use those talents and skills to rise, whether it's in you're making your own business or climbing the corporate ladder somewhere else. That we fundamentally value the individual, and that we use capitalism as our system to reward individuals for their effort, their skills, their insights, and their originality. That we don't hold people back based on their race, their gender, or their ethnicity. We rely on these Enlightenment values of reason and science and rationality that have produced all of this. If you have found much of what's happening in America confusing today, it's probably because you're one of those people that think rationally about the world. You believe in objective truth. You believe there's an objective reality. You believe in the intrinsic value of the individual. You believe in compromise and tolerance. And all of that is under a threat in America today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe and leave a comment down below and I'll be sure to answer it. And feel free to support me at my website or at Patreon. Have a good day.